Creepy things happen before the grave.
The Devil Came to Town, Part 1, by the FoggyGLassEye. At the turn of the millennium, the house next to the Hollands' home was finally purchased after years on the market. It was an admittedly ugly house, shattered windows, a half-finished coat of sickly green paint covering up an ancient, dull brown and overgrown lawn that the Hollands' cat often stalked through as though it were a jungle tiger. But if one had the capital to fix it up, it could be a dream home for anyone wanting to settle down in a quiet little town like Cluster. Mrs. Holland was excited by the arrival of new neighbors and hoped that the children would be around the same ages as Anton and Chris, who were at the time in first and third grade respectively. Mr. Holland, who hosted neighborhood barbecue at least once a month, didn't mind there being a new family next door, so long as the man of the house supported the vandals. First came the tradesmen. The windows were fixed. The plumbing was completely repiped. The old carpeting had been torn up and replaced with hardwood floors, and a fresh coat of deep, royal purple paint had been given to the exterior. From the sounds of the construction going on inside, it seemed that the interior had been remodeled to a notable degree as well. Finally, after over a month of preparations, the new owner of the home arrived. An air of excitement accompanied the moving trucks as they parked before the empty house, filling it with countless cardboard boxes, delicately handled paintings, and breathtaking antique furniture. Mrs. Holland watched all of it through the kitchen window, gasping at some of the pieces that were being moved in. After the movers had left, a black van was driven into the garage, the windows tinted too dark for Mrs. Holland to get a good look at the driver. The second vehicle, however, a '59 Eldorado cherry red, was carefully parked in the driveway by someone Mrs. Holland could get a solid look at. As he exited the car, the man removed his tea shades, taking a moment to enjoy the view of the house from up front. He had very short hair, almost bald, and was fresh-faced. His cheeks were sunken in, and he looked quite thin. Before stepping inside, he turned to meet Mrs. Holland's gaze. His eyes were dark brown, nearly black. Surprised to suddenly be seen, Mrs. Holland smiled awkwardly, waving politely at the stranger. He smiled and nodded in acknowledgement of his audience, then stepped into his home. After noticing the Cadillac in the neighbor's driveway, Mr. Holland asked his wife if she got a good look at the man who owned such a car. She confirmed that she did, and admitted that her first interaction with him was unsettling. Mr. Holland brushed off her concerns, telling her that she was simply embarrassed to be caught snooping on her new neighbor.
"Don't you worry,"
he told Mrs. Holland.
"We'll get to know him soon enough. I will swing by and invite him to the barbecue next weekend."
They didn't know it, but the devil had come to town. Chapter 2.
"Colin Thorne,"
he said, offering his hand.
"Craig Holland,"
Mr. Holland replied, shaking his new neighbor's hand. Despite his thin frame, Mr. Thorne's grip was quite strong.
"Just wanted to invite you and yours to the neighborhood. We're having a barbecue this weekend if you'd like to come."
Mr. Thorne smiled lightly, a grin with no teeth to it.
"We'd be happy to," he said. "I'd love to be introduced to my new neighbors, and my fiancé has a spiced macaroni salad that I'm sure she'd love to bring along."
Mr. Holland was surprised by the offer.
"Oh, no need to put yourselves out. You're guests, after all." "I insist," Mr. Thorne replied. "A neighborhood is a family, in a way, and I would feel quite useless if I didn't contribute to family. I'm sure you feel the exact same way." Of course,"
Mr. Holland agreed, suddenly feeling as though he were on the spot.
"It's all about family. That reminds me. The wife wanted me to ask if you had any kids. My boys are 6 and 8, so the first thing she thought when she saw the moving trucks was play dates. Would if I could, but it's not in the cards. However, he added with another smile, I have several relatives, nieces and nephews included, who are sure to visit. What Mr. Holland did not know, however, was that the Devil's family had already arrived. It seemed that, in the years leading to Mr. Thorne's arrival, nearly all of the neighborhoods had at least one new family living amongst those who were born and raised in Cluster. They all attended their neighborhood's functions. They all went to the same supermarket that opened near the road at the far edge of town, and they all attended the same church every Sunday. Chapter 3. Over the years, the supermarket seemed to take most of the business from the town's main street. Storefronts closed and families went under. The social gatherings between neighbors began to turn towards the concept of supporting local businesses, but it seemed that every street had at least a few people with very good, almost rehearsed reasons to continue shopping at the supermarket. Think about this, they would say to the neighbors. The store has over 100 employees and they rely on our money to succeed. Sure, strangers buy from the supermarket while passing through, but the store would have to close its doors without the loyal customers of Cluster. If one local family running one store has to close up shop, that's 100 local families that keep their jobs. A small price to pay, if you ask me. Mr. Thorne, however, never took part in such conversations. He was very open about his role as liaison to the company that ran the supermarket. While drinking beers and watching a Vandals game, Mr. Holland asked Mr. Thorne if he thought small businesses were more important than big corporations, like the one who he worked for. His friend had just closed his bait and tackle store for good, blaming it on the fishing aisle of the supermarket. I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Thorne said, hanging his head low. There's no right answer to your question, especially not coming from me. I say this because the supermarket has 3 people who work in the fishing supply aisle. 4, if you include the associate who stocks the shelves during the night shift, and 5, if you include the janitor. If we made the decision to remove the aisle tomorrow so that your friend's shop would be the only option for fishing supplies in all of Cluster, then those 3 workers who man the aisle throughout the week would have to be let go. We simply do not have openings to keep them all. We could resign 1, maybe 2 of them, if they were both willing to work part-time hours. What makes it so tough is that I know these workers. The first is a teenager who, if he follows through with his plans to save up enough money for community college, would be the first in his family to do so. The second is a recovering alcoholic who was about to be evicted from his mobile home when he first gave him a chance to earn his keep. An opportunity he has yet to squander. The third is a single mother who constantly reaches out to the manager for overtime opportunities as she has 4 young mouths to feed at home. I've gotten to know them as well as any other associate of the store, and I would call them family. Mr. Thorne sighed heavily, as though the weight of such responsibility was a burden. He held a smile in as he continued. However, you are a friend of this man, and you are a friend of mine. Simply say the word, and I will close down the aisle, giving your friend a monopoly on the bait and tackle business in town. Mr. Holland took a long look at the man sitting beside him. For the first time, he wondered who this man truly was. What kind of person would make that kind of offer? Was it a test? A game? Did he even have the authority to do such a thing? Of course, Mr. Thorne added, taking a sip of his beer. I'm sure we could find room for him somewhere in the store, should he need a new source of income. He knows how to run a business, so he definitely has management potential. And, as if it was nothing more to consider, he returned his attention to the game. Mr. Holland looked up at the screen, allowing it to distract him.
The vandals were down, and what else was new? The Ducks were slaughtering them, but nothing would be worse than the ass-whooping the Broncos had given them earlier that month. At this rate, even Arkansas State would. "Don't do it," he blurted out, surprising both Mr. Thorne and himself. He sucked air in from between his clenched teeth, realizing that he'd been holding in his breath. His eyes stung. "Just let it be. I'm sure he'll be fine." "Okay," Mr. Thorne said simply, before turning back to the game once more. The devil didn't like sports. Too much left to chance, but he could never pass up quality time with his neighbor. There was so much work to do, after all. The following morning, he stopped by the home of Mr. Holland's friend. "Good morning, Mr. Nicholson," he said. "Mike," the man said simply. "Mike, then," Mr. Thorne agreed. "I'm a mutual friend of Craig, and I've just been informed of what happened to your store." "What about it?" Mike asked bitterly. "Well, I would like to preface this with the fact that what I'm about to offer you may sound insulting given the context." Mr. Thorne was forced to hold in a smile before he continued. "I work for the supermarket, and while I understand that you likely have quite negative feelings about us, I do know how important it is to put food on the table. Effectively, I'm offering you a job with us, if you'd like one." Mike listened to every word Mr. Thorne had to say, then proceeded to threaten to separate Mr. Thorne's head from his body if he didn't walk away. A week later, Mike Nicholson submitted an application. Chapter 4. The town of Cluster began to change, or perhaps rot. As more years passed, the decade anniversary of Mr. Thorne's arrival was marked by the highest crime rates that Cluster had ever seen. With more business generated by the supermarket came more strangers, and with more strangers came more of the homeless, and with more of the homeless came more theft and vandalism. An outspoken citizen of Cluster, one of the few who still cursed the names of anyone responsible for the slow death of Main Street storefronts, had reached his breaking point. He was all kinds of dangerous. A man with a beautiful wife and 2 children, a man with a solid reputation amongst his neighbors, a man with charisma and vision. His eyes were set on the person that he blamed for the town's decline, the mayor, whose term was ending soon. Mr. Thorne had been working closely with the mayor even before the supermarket had been built. The man had long ago been bought and paid for, but was terrified by the prospect of losing the power and status he had. Mr. Thorne assured the mayor that he had nothing to worry about, but the man seemed insistent on becoming a liability. He met with Mr. Thorne in the basement of his home for their monthly appointment. Mr. Thorne's assistant, the woman who had been playing the part of fiancée turned wife for the last decade, lit the torches along the walls as Mr. Thorne laid out his plans. "Your challenger will never be a part of our family, and so he must be made to leave," Mr. Thorne said as they approached the shackled man, a dirty vagrant hanging from his ankles, a stranger whose face was quickly turning red. "Our friends in the church, the school, and the supermarket have all been targeting and discrediting him since before he announced his candidacy. He will realize how unwelcome he is, and he will leave." The vagrant reached out towards the mayor, who kicked his hand away and grimaced. "But what if he wins?" the mayor asked, turning his attention to his superior. "He could scrape the votes together. Honestly, we could just rig the thing, but you seem too intent on the votes remaining legitimate." Mr. Thorne retrieved the Kaiser blade from the table, making a mental note to return it to his neighbor the next morning, after it was cleaned, of course. "You don't seem to understand," he said, glancing briefly over to the mayor, before resting the Kaiser blade against the vagrant's neck. With quick, clinical motion that one could understandably mistake for being emotionless, Mr. Thorne slit the man's throat open. Blood sprang onto the dirt floor below their feet. As the blood began to soak into the earth, Mr. Thorne smiled fully, and the mayor realized that he hadn't seen the man's teeth before. There will be no need to rig the vote. Your challenger will not make it to election day. Enough business talk, Mr. Thorne's associate said, kneeling before the dying man. Let us pray. And so they did, but the unsettled aura surrounding the mayor remained. As soon as the ceremony was over and his guest was out of his home, Mr. Thorne told his assistant to have the mayor followed. I do not trust him, Mr. Thorne admitted. He seems more interested in the power that comes with the role than the purpose of his instructions. I fear that he will go too far. The following evening, as Mr. Thorne was looking over the most recent polls for the mayoral race, his assistant entered the room with a laptop in hand. You need to see this, sir, she said, setting the computer before him. Pressing the space bar, she started a video. The video had been recorded from the outside of a backyard's wood fence. Two men were seated at a patio table, and while the footage was blurry and hard to make out, Mr. Thorne could hear the mayor's voice clearly enough. Cluster is far larger than the supermarket, the mayor said to the man sitting across from him. I can prove it. Come to my office in City Hall tonight, after midnight, and I'll show you everything. When was this recorded? Mr. Thorne asked calmly. An hour ago, the assistant replied. He was followed to the house of his competition. Really? Mr. Thorne asked, smiling. I expected his betrayal to come sooner rather than later, but this isn't just some desperate power grab. This is a guilty conscience. That is delicious. Mr. Thorne handed the laptop to his assistant, then made his way to the front door. Where are you going? She asked. Their meeting is scheduled for after midnight, so I will be there before. Mr. Thorne took the black van downtown, parking it across the street from the mayor's office. He checked his watch as he neared the side entrance. It was almost 11 in the evening. He had more than enough time. The building seemed entirely empty as he stalked the halls, stepping so lightly that no sound accompanied him, and the sounds of shuffling papers and mumbled curses in the distance grew louder as he approached the mayor's office. Mr. Thorne stepped in just in time to see the mayor pull a wad of cash out of the office's safe. A duffel bag, presumably filled with clothes, lay on the otherwise clear desk. Smiling to himself, Mr. Thorne sat on the couch near the door, waiting patiently for the mayor to realize that he was there. After pulling another stack of money, all hundreds, out of the safe, the mayor turned around and nearly jumped out of his skin when he realized that he wasn't alone. Don't bother with the lies and excuses, Mr. Thorne spat, just as the mayor's mouth was about to open. He stood, and the mayor stepped back. You are a worm, he said, stepping forward. I won't tell anyone, the mayor said, setting the money on the table before putting his hands up. Listen, I'll just go. I'll find somewhere else. I'll keep my mouth shut. You won't tell anyone of our practices, our plans? Mr. Thorne asked, smiling skeptically. Not a soul? I promise, the mayor said. Wait, Mr. Thorne said, holding up a finger. That won't do. You see, you'd have to promise not to tell another soul, considering that you already informed your competition. No, the mayor lied, taking another step back, bumping into the wall behind him. I would never betray the family. Of course, Mr. Thorne said, smiling widely as he closed in on the mayor. He picked up the stack of $100 bills.
I promise you this. You will never have to worry about betrayal again.
Lunging forward, Mr. Thorne took hold of the mayor's throat and pushed him against the wall. Before the mayor could scream, a handful of hundreds were shoved into his mouth. More dollars followed, pushed further until Mr. Thorne was certain that the mayor's throat had been filled with the bills. The mayor's face grew red, then purple as he struggled. Mr. Thorne held him in place as he thrashed about, as his eyes went bloodshot, as the life began to drain from him. Finally, he let the mayor collapse to the ground behind his desk. After taking a moment to compose himself, Mr. Thorne looked at his watch. It was almost midnight. He closed the safe, turned the light off, and returned to his seat on the couch. The man who had challenged the mayor was punctual, which Mr. Thorne respected. He arrived just after midnight, and as he entered the mayor's office, he ran straight for the body.
At least it was quick,
Mr. Thorne lied, holding in a smile as the man jumped.
What the hell is going on here?
The man asked, his voice shaking. He was putting on a brave face, another admirable trait. He would have been a valuable asset had the right attention been paid to him. A true zealot among believers, but he had instead become an obstacle. Mr. Thorne allowed himself to smile as he considered his options, wondering what he should do with the problem. Finally, he settled on an idea. Cluster was chosen for, among other key variables, their religious nature, the fear of God, he decided.
Cluster is a quiet town, or at least it used to be. That's how we liked it. People came and went, strangers with new faces and unknown intent, not an odd sight given the allure of the supermarket. For all the bad the store does, it serves as a uniquely important purpose. It allows for strangers to go about their business without their presence being questioned. You understand?
Mr. Thorne watched as the man took another look at the mayor's body. The look reminded Mr. Thorne of his own master, a man who would take all the time he needed when looking over his precious chessboards. He measured every move, every option. It was a trait he respected.
If I'm reading between the lines here,
the man finally said,
you're saying the supermarket's a cover for whatever the mayor was wrapped up in. That about right?
Stifling a laugh, Mr. Thorne allowed his smile to grow. Oh, he truly did back the wrong house here, he had to admit. This man had so much potential.
As close to right as one could manage, given how much you don't know,
he confessed.
However, the amount that you do know is liable to change. As you might have noticed, it looks like you're running unopposed.
He gestured to the mayor's body.
Perhaps we should have a discussion about your policies going forward.
His eyes welling up with tears, his head shaking, the man could barely speak as he responded.
If this is politics, I want nothing to do with it.
A pity, but a safe one for all involved, Mr. Thorne considered. The man was quite interesting to him, enough for him to be allowed to live.
You're free to go, of course,
Mr. Thorne said, knowing that even if the man didn't believe him, he was telling the truth.
You have to leave the keys, of course.
The man turned away, setting the keys on the desk.
Whoever you are, whatever you're a part of, are you saying you won't come after me or my family?
he asked. And now for the fear of God. Mr. Thorne decided, rising silently to his feet and stepping forward as the man turned around, now face to face with Mr. Thorne. He simply stared, petrified. Mr. Thorne had to admit, this he enjoyed. We have no interest in forgettable people. You understand? The man mustered the courage to move, using it to nod in agreement. Of course, I definitely do. Politics just isn't for me. I can see that clear as day. Checkmate, Mr. Thorne thought, gesturing to the door. Then go. I will suggest, however, that you consider your choice. If you walk out of this room, you do well to keep walking right out of cluster. Without a moment of further consideration, the man walked right past Mr. Thorne and out of the room. What a lovely chat, he mused to himself, picking up the keys the man had left behind. When he was sure that the man was gone, Mr. Thorne pulled his cell phone out of his inner jacket pocket, calling Cluster's head coroner. The mayor has passed away, he told the man before he could say a word. As your reports will reflect, he ended his own life, a coward's death. The method will be up to you, and do feel free to be creative with the details. His body is in his office, and the front door will be unlocked when you arrive. Have a pleasant evening. And after taking one final look at the disappointment laying behind the desk, Mr. Thorne left.